In the isolated desert communications bunker of Falcon Outpost, a seemingly broken officer was about to detect the deadliest threat NATO forces had faced in years. What started as routine signal monitoring took a shocking turn when she came face to face with encrypted transmissions that would expose a coordinated enemy strike. Lieutenant Mara Keene wasn't your typical communications officer. For 6 months, she had spent her life in military exile, known for her methodical precision and an uncanny ability to detect patterns others missed, the same skills that had been dismissed as paranoia after a sabotaged exercise destroyed her career. When she encountered hostile targeting radar signatures buried in routine NATO frequencies, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy designed to silence her forever. Mara's refusal to ignore the threat that would lead to her commanding an unauthorized F-22 strike against overwhelming institutional resistance. What began as mysterious signal bursts in the Nevada desert would become a race against time to prevent a massacre. The military establishment would never be the same after discovering that the unreliable officer they'd cast aside had just saved an entire NATO convoy from annihilation. The quiet voice they'd tried to silence had just spoken loud enough to shake the foundations of command itself and prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that roars, but the one that whispers the truth no one wants to hear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind carried sand through the gaps in the communications bunker's weathered walls, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that Lieutenant Mara Keene had long since stopped bothering to wipe away. She sat before a bank of monitors in the cramped room, her fingers dancing across keyboards with practiced efficiency as encrypted transmissions scrolled past in endless streams of data. NATO exercises, routine position reports, supply requests, the mundane heartbeat of military operations flowing through frequencies most people would never know existed. Falcon Outpost was where the Air Force sent officers who were technically competent but somehow didn't fit. Too quiet for leadership roles, too methodical for fast-track careers, too damaged by past failures to trust with anything important. Mara had been here for 6 months now, monitoring communications traffic that rarely required anything more complex than logging timestamps and forwarding messages up the chain. She preferred it this way, she told herself. No one expected grand gestures or bold decisions. No one watched her every move, waiting for her to crack under pressure. Here in the desert, surrounded by humming servers and the occasional visit from maintenance techs, she could simply do her job without the weight of expectations crushing down on her shoulders. The wall-mounted clock showed 14:30 hours when she noticed the first anomaly, a brief signal buried in the routine NATO frequency sweep that didn't match any of the standard encryption patterns. It lasted only 3 seconds, barely a blip in the constant stream of data. Most operators would have missed it entirely or dismissed it as equipment noise. But Mara had always been different. While other officers learned to scan for the obvious threats, she had trained herself to notice the spaces between notes, the subtle variations. The sound of boots on concrete made her look up from her monitors. Colonel Bryce Harlan stood in the doorway, his uniform immaculate despite the desert heat, his presence filling the small communications room like a gathering storm. Behind him, 2 junior officers waited at attention, clipboards in hand, for what appeared to be an inspection tour. Lieutenant Keene? His voice carried the same tone she remembered from 6 months ago, professionally cordial on the surface, with an undercurrent of dismissal that made her feel like an insect under a microscope. "How are we finding our accommodations here at Falcon Outpost?" "The equipment is adequate for our mission requirements, sir." Mara kept her voice steady, her eyes focused on a point just over his left shoulder. She had learned not to look directly at him. It only seemed to remind him of things he preferred to forget. Adequate? Harlan stepped closer to her workstation, his gaze sweeping across the monitors. "And what exactly is our mission here, Lieutenant?
Remind me. Heat crept up Mara's neck, but she maintained her composure. Communications monitoring and relay for NATO exercises and Allied operations in the Southwestern Theater, sir. That's right, monitoring. He emphasized the word as if it tasted bitter. Not analysis, not decision-making, just watching and listening, like a very expensive security camera. He paused, letting the words sink in. I trust you're finding this role more suited to your particular strengths. One of the junior officers shifted uncomfortably behind him. Even they could sense the cruelty in the question, the way it was designed to remind her of her failure during the Crimson Sky exercise, the failed communications protocol that had branded her unreliable under pressure, the public humiliation that had stripped away everything she had worked for. Yes, sir, the role suits me fine. Excellent. Harlan's smile was sharp as a blade. It's important to know one's limitations. The Air Force has no patience for officers who overestimate their capabilities, especially in situations requiring split-second decisions under pressure. He glanced at his watch. Carry on, Lieutenant. I'm sure you have many important observations to record. After he left, the communications room felt larger somehow, as if his presence had been compressing the air itself. Mara forced herself to return to her monitors, her hands slightly unsteady as she resumed logging the incoming transmissions. The familiar routine gradually steadied her nerves, the endless stream of data providing a refuge from the memory of Harlan's words. As her shift neared its end, she noticed it again. The same anomalous signal, appearing for exactly 3 seconds before disappearing into the background noise. This time she was ready for it. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating the frequency and running it through the spectra analyzer. The waveform that appeared on her screen made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't random noise. It was structured, deliberate, a burst transmission designed to look like equipment malfunction to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. And now that she was looking, she could see the pattern. Every 4 minutes and 17 seconds, like clockwork. Mara glanced around the empty communications room, then opened a new analysis window on her workstation. Whatever this signal was, it was intentional. And if someone was transmitting coded bursts on NATO frequencies every 4 minutes and 17 seconds, they had a reason for it. A reason that probably wasn't friendly. The night shift at Falcon Outpost was even quieter than the day rotation. Mara had volunteered to stay late, claiming she wanted to complete the daily communications log, but the truth was more complicated. The mysterious signal had appeared 3 more times during her regular shift, each burst lasting exactly 3 seconds and occurring with mechanical precision every 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Now that with the communications room to herself, she could investigate without curious eyes looking over her shoulder. She pulled up the spectral analysis software and began feeding the isolated signal bursts through a series of filters. The first thing she noticed was that the frequency was shifting slightly with each transmission, not randomly, but in a pattern that suggested movement. Doppler shift. Whatever was sending this signal was in motion, probably airborne and following a specific flight path. "You're still here?" Sergeant Darius Cole's voice made her jump. She hadn't heard him enter the communications bunker, his soft-soled boots silent on the concrete floor. At 25, Cole was technically her subordinate, but his expertise with electronic warfare systems made him invaluable to the small communications team at Falcon Outpost. Just finishing up some analysis? Mara minimized the spectral display and turned to face him. "Thought you'd gone off duty hours ago." "Couldn't sleep. Desert heat makes me restless." Cole dropped into the chair beside her workstation and gestured at her monitors. "What kind of analysis keeps a communications officer here past midnight? Found some exciting..." Despite his casual tone, Mara detected genuine curiosity in his voice. Cole had a reputation for being irreverent and slightly cynical, but he was also one of the few people at Falcon Outpost who treated her like a competent officer rather than a cautionary tale. She made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, She decided to trust someone. "I've been tracking an anomalous signal." She reopened the spectral analysis window. "Take a look at this." Cole leaned forward, his expression shifting from mild interest to focused attention as he studied the waveform patterns. Burst transmission, short duration, regular intervals. He frowned. "Frequency shifting, though. You're thinking airborne source?" "That's what the Doppler analysis suggests. And look at this." Mara pulled up a frequency comparison chart. "The base pattern matches encryption protocols from the Balkan conflicts, but it's been modified. Someone's using old military frequencies, but with updated modulation." "Ghost chatter," Cole said dismissively, leaning back in his chair. "Probably just old equipment somewhere generating harmonics, or maybe some ham radio operator playing with surplus military gear. You know how these things are. Every weird signal looks like a conspiracy when you stare at it long enough." "Every 4 minutes and 17 seconds? Mara highlighted the timestamp intervals. "For the past 8 hours? That's not equipment malfunction, Darius. That's a deliberate transmission schedule." Cole studied the data more carefully, his casual demeanor fading as he began to see what she was seeing. "Okay, so someone's transmitting on military frequencies. Could be a test, could be training, could be any number of legitimate operations we're not read in on. You know how compartmentalized everything is these days." "Then why isn't it on the daily frequency coordination list?" Mara pulled up the official scheduling documents. "Every authorized transmission in this frequency band should be logged here. This signal doesn't exist in any official database." "So what are you suggesting? That someone's running unauthorized transmissions through NATO frequencies?" Cole's voice carried a note of skepticism, but Mara could see doubt creeping into his expression. "You want to file a report about ghost signals based on 8 hours of data?" Before Mara could answer, her monitoring system chimed with an incoming transmission alert. They both turned to watch as another burst appeared on the spectral analyzer. But this time, something was different. The signal lasted 4 seconds instead of 3, and the frequency shift was more pronounced. "It's moving faster," Mara whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she captured and analyzed the new transmission. Whatever's broadcasting this signal just accelerated. Cole was silent for a long moment, studying the new data. When he spoke, his voice had lost its casual dismissiveness. "That's not equipment malfunction." "No, it's not." She spent the next 2 hours documenting everything: signal strength, frequency variations, timing intervals, and the gradual changes in the Doppler shift that suggested the transmitter was following a specific flight path. Cole helped, despite his obvious reluctance, his technical expertise proving invaluable as they built a comprehensive analysis of the mysterious transmissions. At 300 hours, Mara drafted a preliminary report to Operations Command. She kept the language clinical and factual, avoiding any speculation about the signal's purpose or origin, just the data, presented clearly and professionally. The kind of report that should trigger an investigation, or at least a request for additional monitoring. She submitted it through official channels and waited. The response came back 4 hours later. "Insufficient data for investigation. Continue routine monitoring. No further action required." "Insufficient data?" Cole read the response over her shoulder. "You documented 8 hours of regular transmissions with clear patterns and movement indicators. What more do they want?" Mara stared at the terse dismissal on her screen, feeling a familiar weight settle in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd had during the Crimson Sky exercise, when her attempts to report equipment problems had been brushed aside until the entire communication network collapsed. The feeling of being invisible, of having her voice fall into a void where competent observations went to die. "Maybe she's right," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm seeing patterns that aren't there." "Bullshit!" Cole's vehemence surprised her. "I may not know what that signal is, but it's definitely real, and it's definitely not random." He gestured at the data on her screen. Someone up the chain doesn't want to deal with this, but that doesn't make you wrong. That night, alone in her small quarters, Mara lay awake, listening to the desert wind and thinking about the mysterious signal. Every 4 minutes and 17 seconds, somewhere in the darkness above the outpost, something was broadcasting coded messages that no one wanted to acknowledge. The rational part of her mind whispered that Cole was wrong, that Operations Command was right to dismiss her report. After all, she was the officer who'd failed during the Crimson Sky exercise, the one whose judgment couldn't be trusted. But another part of her mind, the part that had always noticed details others missed, kept returning to the same troubling question. If the signal was harmless, why was it working so hard to look like equipment noise? At 0247 hours, her secure communications terminal chimed with an incoming priority transmission. Mara bolted upright and reached for her headset, expecting routine traffic or maybe an emergency drill. Instead, she found herself listening to the same mysterious signal she'd been tracking, but this time, it was different. The burst lasted 6 seconds instead of 3. The frequency shift indicated rapid acceleration, and buried in the electronic noise, almost below the threshold of detection, was something that made her blood run cold. The faint but unmistakable signature of weapons targeting radar. 6 months earlier, Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. The morning of the Crimson Sky exercise dawned clear and hot, with visibility stretching to the horizon across the desert training range. Lieutenant Mara Keene stood in the communications trailer that served as the nerve center for the multi-service training operation, surrounded by banks of radio equipment and digital displays showing the positions of aircraft, ground units, and support teams spread across 300 square miles of Nevada wasteland. "Final equipment check in 15 minutes, announced Major Patricia Wells, the exercise director. "This is a live-fire exercise with real-time NATO integration. No do-overs, no second chances. When the balloon goes up, we perform like we would in actual combat." Mara nodded and turned back to her workstation, where she was responsible for coordinating communications between air and ground units during the simulated battle scenario. It was a high-visibility assignment, the kind that could make or break a young officer's career. Colonel Bryce Harlan had personally recommended her for the role, claiming her technical expertise and calm demeanor made her ideal for the pressure cooker environment of a major exercise. She should have been suspicious of his sudden confidence in her abilities. The frequency coordination tables lay open beside her keyboard, thick binders containing the precise radio frequencies, encryption keys, and timing protocols that would keep dozens of aircraft and ground units talking to each other without interference. These tables were the foundation of military communications, updated constantly and distributed with military precision to ensure that every operator was working from identical information. What Mara didn't know was that Colonel Harlan had personally modified her copy of the frequency tables 3 days earlier, introducing subtle but critical errors that would cascade through the communications network once the exercise began. Frequencies shifted by mere kilohertz, encryption keys offset by single digits, changes small enough to pass casual inspection, but devastating when implemented across an entire operation. "Crimson Sky is live," announced Major Wells. "All units, commence operations." For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded smoothly. Mara coordinated between A-10 attack aircraft and forward ground controllers, relayed targeting information from reconnaissance drones to artillery units, and maintained the complex web of communications that kept the exercise flowing. Her voice remained calm and professional as she juggled multiple conversations simultaneously, her fingers dancing across the radio controls with practiced precision. Then the system began to collapse. "Falcon 27, say again your last transmission," she called to an A-10 attack aircraft, whose radio calls were becoming increasingly garbled. "Falcon 27 is requesting immediate fire support coordinates for target Bravo 6. Are you receiving my transmission? I have targets in sight, but cannot engage without proper coordinates." Mara checked her frequency settings against the coordination tables, confirming she was on the correct channel with the proper encryption active. But somehow, the pilot's transmissions were fragmenting into digital noise halfway through each message. She tried switching to the backup frequency, but that channel was completely silent, as if the entire ground support network had vanished. Lightning Control, this is Falcon 27. I'm not receiving any ground coordination signals. Request immediate verification of communication status. Around the communications trailer, other operators were beginning to report similar problems. Radio networks that had functioned perfectly during the pre-exercise tests were now dropping connections randomly. Encrypted channels were producing nothing but static. Digital data links were timing out before critical information could be transmitted. Mara felt sweat beading on her forehead as she worked frantically to restore communications, trying different frequencies and encryption settings in an attempt to re-establish contact with the aircraft that were now flying blind over the exercise range. She could hear the frustration mounting in the pilots' voices as they called for support that never came, requested clearances that were never received, and reported positions that no one could acknowledge. Exercise Control, this is Lightning Control. We're experiencing widespread communications failure across multiple networks. Request permission to suspend air operations until we can restore contact. Negative, Lightning Control, Wells replied tersely. This is a NATO integration exercise with international observers present. We do not suspend operations for technical difficulties. Fix your equipment.
Mara's hands shook as she opened the troubleshooting manual, cross-referencing error codes and signal diagnostics in a desperate attempt to identify the problem. But every test came back normal. According to her instruments, the communications equipment was functioning perfectly. The fault appeared to lie somewhere in the frequency coordination itself, but that was impossible. The frequency tables were checked and double-checked before every exercise. Lightning Control, Falcon 27 declaring emergency. The A-10 pilot's voice cut through her troubleshooting efforts. I have lost all navigation references and cannot establish contact with ground control. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest friendly airfield. The blood drained from Mara's face as she realized the scope of the disaster unfolding around her. Multiple aircraft were now operating without proper communication support, unable to coordinate with ground units or receive critical safety information. In a real combat situation, this kind of communications failure would have resulted in friendly fire incidents and mission failure on a catastrophic scale. All aircraft, this is Lightning Control, she broadcast on the emergency frequency. Suspend current operations and return to holding pattern Charlie until further notice. I say again, suspend operations and return to holding pattern Charlie. The response was immediate and damning. Colonel Harlan's voice cut across the communications net like a knife, broadcast on a frequency that every participant in the exercise could hear. Lightning Control, this is Exercise Command, he announced, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. You are not authorized to suspend operations. Return to your assigned communications duties immediately. But sir, we have multiple aircraft operating without proper coordination, Mara replied, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. Continuing operations under these conditions presents an unacceptable safety risk. The safety risk, Lieutenant, comes from communications personnel who panic under pressure instead of performing their assigned duties, Harlan replied coldly. Perhaps if you focused less on making excuses and more on doing your job, our pilots wouldn't be experiencing difficulties. The words hit Mara like a physical blow. Around the communications trailer, she could see other operators looking at her with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. The international observers in the back of the trailer were taking notes, documenting what would undoubtedly be reported as an American communications failure during a critical NATO exercise. For the remaining 2 hours of Crimson Sky, Mara worked frantically to restore proper communications, but the corrupted frequency tables made coordination impossible. Aircraft returned to base early, their pilots frustrated and confused. Ground units completed their objectives in isolation, cut off from the air support they were supposed to receive. The exercise that was meant to demonstrate seamless NATO integration instead became a textbook example of how communications failures could cripple modern military operations. During the post-exercise debrief, Colonel Harlan stood before an audience of senior officers and international observers, his expression grave as he delivered his assessment of the day's events. The communications failure we experienced today highlights a critical weakness in our personnel selection and training protocols, he began, his gaze finding Mara in the audience. Lieutenant Keene's performance under pressure was frankly unacceptable.
When faced with technical difficulties, the kind that are routine in actual combat operations, she became hesitant, indecisive, and ultimately counterproductive to mission success. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. In real combat, such hesitation costs lives. The Air Force cannot afford to have communications officers who crumble under pressure, regardless of their technical qualifications in peacetime conditions. Only one person spoke in Mara's defense during that debrief. Captain Elena Torres, an F-22 pilot who had participated in the exercise, stood up despite the clear disapproval of her superiors. "With respect, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the career risks she was taking. Lieutenant Keene's actions prevented what could have been a major safety incident. When communications networks failed during live-fire exercises, the appropriate response is to suspend operations until safety can be restored. Her decision showed sound judgment under pressure. Harlan's smile was thin and predatory. "Captain Torres, your loyalty to a fellow officer is commendable but misplaced. Lieutenant Keene was responsible for maintaining those communications networks. The failure was hers, and her response to that failure demonstrated exactly why some officers are not suited for high-pressure operational roles." 2 weeks later, Mara received her transfer orders to Falcon Outpost. 6 months of exile in the desert, monitoring communications traffic that rarely required more than basic logging and forwarding. A career death sentence delivered with bureaucratic efficiency and wrapped in the language of operational necessity. What she never learned was that Colonel Harlan had spent those 2 weeks carefully distributing his version of events to anyone who would listen. The story of the communications officer who had panicked during a routine exercise, who had tried to blame equipment failure for her own inadequacies, who represented everything wrong with the military's recent emphasis on diversity.
The real frequency tables, the ones without Harlan's subtle modifications, were quietly destroyed. The backup copies mysteriously disappeared from the secure files, and Lieutenant Mara Keene became a cautionary tale about the dangers of promoting officers who lacked the temperament for real military operations. Now, 6 months later and 1,000 miles away in the desert communications bunker of Falcon Outpost, Mara stared at the spectral analysis of a mysterious signal that carried the unmistakable signature of weapons targeting radar. The same kind of sophisticated electronic warfare signature that would have been detectable during Crimson Sky, if the communications officer responsible for monitoring such things hadn't been distracted by equipment failures that shouldn't have existed. Her hands trembled slightly as she saved the analysis to her secure workstation and began drafting another report to Operations Command. This time she included detailed technical specifications, historical comparisons, and a threat assessment that made it clear she believed they were detecting hostile reconnaissance activity. She also sent a personal message to the one person who had defended her during the darkest moment of her career. Captain Elena Torres was now stationed at Edwards Air Force Base, flying F-22 Raptors in the kind of high-stakes operations that Mara would never be trusted to support again. But sometimes, she reflected, as she hit the send button, it wasn't about trust. Sometimes it was about being right when everyone else was wrong, even if no one wanted to listen, especially then. Mara's second report to Operations Command was more detailed than the first, complete with spectral analysis charts, frequency correlation data, and a preliminary threat assessment based on the weapons targeting signatures she'd detected. She included timestamps, technical specifications, and cross-references to known hostile electronic warfare patterns from the classified database. If this didn't get their attention, nothing would. The response came back within an hour, but not through official channels. Colonel Bryce Harlan appeared in the communications bunker doorway at 0800 hours, his expression thunderous as he strode across the small room toward Mara's workstation. "Lieutenant Keene?" His voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made seasoned non-commissioned officers step carefully.
I understand you've been having some concerns about ghost signals. Mara kept her hand steady on her keyboard, finishing the log entry she'd been typing before looking up at him. Sir, I've documented consistent anomalous transmissions that appear to be what, Lieutenant? Hostile reconnaissance? Enemy communications? Are you seriously suggesting that enemy aircraft are conducting surveillance operations over Nevada without being detected by NORAD, the FAA, or any of our early warning systems? The signals are consistent with targeting radar signatures, sir. The frequency patterns and burst characteristics match. The frequency patterns match your overactive imagination. Harlan leaned closer to her workstation, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. Just like the equipment failures you imagined during Crimson Sky. Tell me, Lieutenant, do you see a pattern here? Heat flushed through Mara's chest, but she forced her voice to remain level. Sir, I have documented evidence of... You have documented evidence of your own paranoia. And frankly, Lieutenant, I'm concerned about your mental state. First, you see equipment failures that don't exist. Now you're seeing enemy aircraft that aren't there. Perhaps it's time to consider whether the stress of military service is affecting your judgment. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Mara felt the walls of the communications bunker closing in around her as she realized what Harlan was doing. He wasn't just dismissing her report. He was building a case for her psychological unfitness for duty. Another failure to add to her record, another reason to question her competence. I request that my analysis be forwarded to the appropriate intelligence agencies for independent verification, she said carefully, choosing each word like stepping stones across a minefield. Harlan's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Your request is noted and denied. As your commanding officer, I have determined that your analysis lacks sufficient credibility to warrant further investigation. The matter is closed. Sir, if I could just... The matter is closed, Lieutenant. His voice carried the finality of a closing tomb. And if you persist in pursuing this fantasy, I will be forced to recommend a psychological evaluation. I'm sure you understand how such evaluations can affect an officer's career prospects. After he left, Mara sat alone in the communications bunker, staring at the data that no one wanted to acknowledge. Every instinct she possessed screamed that the signals were real, that they represented a genuine threat that was being ignored because of who she was and what had happened during Crimson Sky. But instincts didn't matter when your commanding officer was building a case for your mental.
She opened her secure messaging application and composed a message to Captain Elena Torres. It was a risk. Reaching out to someone outside her chain of command could be construed as insubordination, but Torres was the only person in the Air Force who had ever defended her judgment. Elena, need to discuss some unusual signals I've been tracking. Can't go through normal channels. Are you available for a secure call? The response came back an hour later. Available 1400 hours. Use encrypted channel 7. You're asking me to risk my career based on signals that your own commanding officer says don't exist. Captain Elena Torres's voice carried clearly through the encrypted communications link, her tone skeptical but not dismissive. Walk me through this again, Mara. What exactly are you seeing? Mara had spent the previous 3 hours compiling every piece of data she could gather about the mysterious transmissions, organizing it into a presentation that even a skeptical F-22 pilot might find convincing. Structured burst transmissions on NATO frequencies occurring every 4 minutes and 17 seconds for the past 18 hours. The Doppler analysis indicates an airborne source moving in a pattern consistent with reconnaissance overflights. Okay, so someone's flying a pattern and transmitting on military frequencies. Could be any number of legitimate operations. Could be, except the signals aren't on any authorized frequency list, and they're using encryption protocols from the Balkan conflicts. Modified but recognizable. Mara highlighted the relevant sections of her analysis. Elena, the latest bursts include targeting radar signatures. Someone is painting targets with active radar while transmitting position data. There was a long pause before Torres responded. Targeting radar. You're certain about that? As certain as I can be without having the signal authenticated by the intelligence community, which I can't do because Colonel Harlan has classified my reports as the product of psychological instability. Jesus, Mara. He's really going after you hard, isn't he? He's protecting himself. If my analysis is correct, it means his dismissal of the Crimson Sky equipment failures was wrong. And if he was wrong about that, then his version of events might not be the whole truth. Torres's voice carried a new note of interest. What do you need from me? Before Mara could answer, Sergeant Cole appeared in the communications bunker doorway, his expression grim as he approached her workstation. She held up a finger, asking him to wait while she finished the call with Torres. I need someone with operational authority who's willing to listen. If these signals represent what I think they do, people are going to die if we ignore them. I'll keep my crew on standby alert. If you can prove this threat is real, we'll be ready to respond. But Mara, I need real proof, not just signal analysis and speculation. After ending the call, Mara turned to Cole, who was studying the data on her secondary monitor with the intense focus of someone seeing something they didn't like. We have a problem, he said without preamble. I've been running unauthorized spectrum sweeps during my off-duty hours, trying to corroborate your signal intercepts. He gestured at the monitor. Look at this. The display showed a frequency analysis chart covering the past 6 hours. Embedded within the normal communications traffic were dozens of brief signal bursts, all following the same pattern Mara had identified but spread across multiple frequencies. They're not just using one channel anymore. They've gone to frequency hopping mode, probably because they detected our monitoring. And look at this data stream. It's not just position reports and targeting information. They're piggybacking data on civilian communications satellites. Mara felt her blood turn cold as she studied the analysis. They're using our own satellite network to coordinate their operations. Gets worse. I cross-referenced the timing with air traffic control data. Cole pulled up another screen showing civilian flight paths over the southwestern United States. There's a NATO convoy scheduled to transit through the Mojave Desert tomorrow morning. Same route, same time frame as the targeting data in these transmissions. How long until they reach the projected engagement zone? 14 hours, give or take. Cole's voice was tight with urgency. Mara, if someone's planning an air-to-ground strike using stolen satellite coordination, we're looking at a potential massacre. Mara stared at the data, her mind racing through the implications. A convoy of NATO vehicles, probably including high-value personnel and sensitive equipment, moving through a predetermined route that hostile forces had somehow obtained. And the only people who knew about the threat were a disgraced communications officer and a sergeant who was helping her conduct unauthorized surveillance. We need to warn them, she said finally. Through what channels? Harlan will shut us down the moment we try to file another report. And even if we could reach the convoy directly, who's going to believe a couple of junior enlisted personnel claiming to have detected a sophisticated airstrike based on signal intercepts? Mara thought about Torres's words. I need real proof, not just signal analysis and speculation. The problem was that getting real proof would require resources and authority they didn't possess. Unless, Darius, how difficult would it be to access the unmanned aerial?
Cole's expression shifted from concern to alarm. You're talking about unauthorized access to classified systems. That's not just career-ending, that's court-martial territory, possibly treason charges. And if we do nothing, people die. Mara met his gaze steadily. I'm not asking you to do anything. This is my decision, my responsibility. For a long moment, Cole said nothing, studying her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Then he sighed and turned to his workstation. The drone network uses the same satellite links we monitor for routine communications, he said quietly. Theoretically, someone with the right access codes could redirect surveillance assets to verify suspicious activity. Theoretically. And practically? Practically, I know where to find those access codes. Cole's fingers were already moving across his keyboard. Give me 30 minutes and we'll have eyes on whatever's out there. The unauthorized access to the drone surveillance network should have felt like crossing a line from which there was no return. Instead, as Mara watched the high-resolution camera feeds appear on her monitors, she felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in months, she was taking action instead of simply reacting to the disasters that others created around her. "Got 2 birds repositioned over the projected engagement zone," Cole reported, his voice tight with concentration as he manipulated the drone controls. "They're running dark, no official flight plan, no log surveillance mission. If anyone checks the records, it'll look like routine maintenance flights." The camera feeds showed the desert landscape stretching endlessly toward the horizon, empty of everything except scrub brush and the occasional dirt road. But the electromagnetic spectrum analysis painted a different picture. The same mysterious signals they'd been tracking were stronger here, more frequent, and definitely originating from airborne sources. "There," Mara pointed at a faint contact on the radar display. "Bearing 270, altitude approximately 15,000 feet. No transponder signal, no flight plan on file." Cole adjusted the drone cameras, zooming in on the contact until it resolved into a sleek, angular aircraft that neither of them recognized. It was smaller than a fighter jet, but larger than a civilian aircraft, with the kind of swept wing design that suggested it was built for speed and stealth. "That's not one of ours," Cole said grimly, "and it's definitely not civilian." As they watched, the unidentified aircraft began a slow banking turn, following a flight path that would take it directly over the route the NATO convoy was scheduled to use. The signals they'd been tracking intensified, and the drone's electronic warfare sensors detected multiple target acquisition radars going active. "We need to warn the convoy directly," Mara said, reaching for her communications controls. "Forget the chain of command. People are going to die if we don't act." "Wait," Cole held up a hand, studying his communications panel. "I can patch us through to the convoy's field commander, but it'll have to be through encrypted military channels. That means going through the communications hub at Edwards Air Force Base." "Edwards?" Mara's pulse quickened. "That's where Elena is stationed. Your F-22 pilot friend? Perfect. If we can reach her, she can verify our intel and maybe get authorization for a response." Cole's fingers flew across his keyboard. "Give me 30 minutes and we'll have eyes on whatever's out there." The connection took several tense minutes to establish, routing through 3 different satellite networks and 2 ground stations before Torres's voice finally came through clearly. "Lightning Control, this is Falcon Lead. You're coming through encrypted channels with no listed authorization. Identify yourself and state your purpose." "Elena, it's Mara Keene at Falcon Outpost. We have eyes on hostile aircraft preparing to engage a NATO convoy. I need you to contact the field commander and warn them they're heading into an ambush." There was a brief pause before Torres responded, her voice sharp with alarm. "Mara, you're on unauthorized frequencies using encrypted channels. This better be genuine emergency traffic. Look at your tactical display bearing 270 from the Mojave exercise area. We have a drone providing overwatch, and there are definitely hostile aircraft operating in that airspace." Another pause. Longer this time. When Torres spoke again, her tone had shifted to pure military professionalism. "Falcon Lead copies contact bearing 270. I'm showing unknown aircraft on radar, no transponder, no flight plan. How certain are you about hostile intent?" "They're actively painting targets with acquisition radar," Mara replied. "Elena, the convoy is scheduled to reach the engagement zone in 6 hours. If someone doesn't stop these aircraft—" "Understood. I'm contacting the convoy commander directly." Torres's voice carried the kind of decisive authority that Mara had always envied. "Maintain your surveillance and keep this frequency open." As Torres worked to establish contact with the convoy, Cole continued monitoring the hostile aircraft through the drone feeds. What they saw made both of them. Unidentified aircraft had been joined by 2 others, and all 3 were now flying in a coordinated pattern that suggested a planned strike operation. "They're setting up for a coordinated attack," Cole observed, his voice grim. "Classic air-to-ground engagement formation. Those convoy vehicles won't stand a chance against a coordinated strike like this." Mara was about to respond when her communications panel lit up with an incoming priority transmission from Operations Command. The caller identification made her blood run cold. Colonel Bryce Harlan. Lieutenant Keene, report to Operations Command immediately. His voice cut through the communications bunker like a blade. You are to cease all unauthorized communications activities and surrender control of your workstation to the duty officer. Sir, we have confirmation of hostile aircraft preparing to engage. You have confirmation of nothing except your own insubordination. Harlan's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Sergeant Cole, you will immediately cease all unauthorized system access and report to the security office for debriefing. Mara met Cole's gaze across the communications bunker, his expression torn between duty and conscience. She could see him weighing the consequences of continuing their unauthorized surveillance against the potential cost of stopping now. Darius, whatever happens next, it's my responsibility. You've done enough. But even as she spoke, both of them could hear Torres's voice through the encrypted channel, sharp with urgency, as she coordinated with the convoy commander. Understood. I'm authorizing immediate course change to avoid the engagement zone. All units, alter course to bearing 090 and increase speed to maximum. The convoy was changing course, but would it be enough? And how long before Harlan shut down their surveillance entirely? The security lockout came without warning. One moment, Mara was watching the drone feeds and coordinating with Torres. The next moment, her screens went black and a red warning message appeared. Access denied. Security violation. Contact system administrator. Son of a bitch, Cole muttered, staring at his own locked workstation. Harlan's pulled our access to everything. Communications, surveillance, even the basic monitoring systems. Mara tried her secure communications link to Torres, but that too had been severed. They were cut off from the outside world, isolated in a communications bunker that could no longer communicate with anyone. The irony would have been amusing if lives weren't hanging in the balance. The hostile aircraft are still out there, she said, frustration evident in her voice. The convoy may have changed course, but we have no way to track the threat or coordinate a response. Actually, Cole said slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face, we might have one option left. Harlan locked us out of the official systems, but there's a backup network for the unmanned aerial coordination system. It's designed to function independently in case of cyber attacks or system failures. You can still access the drones? Better than that, the backup network includes direct links to tactical aircraft systems. If your friend Torres is still monitoring the situation, I might be able to establish contact through the emergency coordination frequency. Cole moved to a secondary workstation in the corner of the bunker, one that Mara had barely noticed during her months at Falcon Outpost. It was older than the primary systems, with manual controls and analog displays that looked like they belonged in a museum. This is the emergency coordination system, he explained as he powered it up. It's designed to function when everything else fails, lower tech but more reliable. The ancient monitors flickered to life, displaying basic radar contacts and communication frequencies. Cole's fingers moved across the controls with surprising expertise, and after several tense minutes, he managed to establish a weak connection to the drone surveillance network. Got limited access to the birds. No camera feeds, but I can see basic radar contacts and electromagnetic signatures. The display showed what they had feared. The 3 hostile aircraft were still maintaining their attack formation, and they had adjusted course to intercept the convoy's new route. Whenever intelligence network was coordinating the attack, it was sophisticated enough to adapt to a convoy's evasive maneuvers in real time. They're still tracking the convoy, she said, studying the tactical display. Changing course wasn't enough. Cole nodded grimly. These aren't random hostiles. This is a planned operation with real-time intelligence support. They know exactly where that convoy is going. Can you reach Elena through this system? Maybe. Give me a minute to find the right frequency. Cole adjusted several analog dials, and static filled the air as he searched for the tactical frequency Torres would be monitoring. After what felt like an eternity, her voice came through the speakers, faint but audible. Falcon lead to any station.
I have 3 hostile contacts maintaining attack formation despite convoy course change. Request immediate authorization for defensive engagement. Elena, this is Mara on the emergency coordination frequency. We still have limited surveillance access. The hostiles are adapting.
Mara? Thank God. I thought we'd lost contact entirely. What's your assessment of the tactical situation? Cole leaned toward the microphone. Ma'am, this is Sergeant Cole. Based on our surveillance data, the hostile aircraft have real-time intelligence on the convoy's position and movements. They're coordinating with ground-based assets to maintain targeting solutions. Copy that. I'm requesting permission to engage, but Operations Command is demanding verification through official channels. Taurus's voice carried a note of frustration that Mara recognized all too well. They want me to wait for confirmation from intelligence agencies before authorizing defensive action. Elena, Mara said urgently, by the time official confirmation comes through, the convoy will be under attack. You have the authorization of an Air Force communications officer who is tracking the threat in real time. An Air Force communications officer who's been locked out of her own systems for insubordination, Taurus replied. Mara, I believe you, but I need something more concrete to justify engaging what could be friendly aircraft on an unannounced training mission. Cole was studying the electromagnetic analysis display, his expression growing increasingly alarmed. Ma'am, the hostile aircraft just went to full targeting mode. All 3 are painting the convoy with fire control radar. That's hostile intent, Taurus said immediately. Falcon lead, engaging. Through the emergency coordination system, they could track Taurus's F-22 as it accelerated toward the engagement zone, the distinctive signature of its advanced radar systems cutting through the electronic noise like a sword. The hostile aircraft detected her approach and immediately broke formation, but they had already committed to their attack run. Falcon lead to lightning control. Taurus's voice was calm despite the high-speed maneuvering that must have been throwing massive G-forces through her aircraft. I have tone on the lead hostile. Request final authorization for engagement. Mara stared at the tactical display, watching the electronic representation of a life-and-death decision playing out in real time. 3 hostile aircraft versus 1 F-22. A NATO convoy full of personnel whose names she didn't know, but whose lives depended on the words she spoke next. Falcon lead, this is lightning control. You are cleared to engage. Repeat, you are cleared to engage hostile aircraft. Copy lightning control. Falcon lead engaging with AIM-120 missiles. Fox 3, Fox 3. The tactical displays showed Taurus's missiles streaking toward their targets at Mach 3, but the hostile aircraft had detected the launch and were taking evasive action. 2 of them peeled off in different directions, deploying countermeasures and diving toward the desert floor in desperate attempts to break the missile lock. The 3rd aircraft, however, continued its attack run toward the convoy. Falcon lead, splash 1, Taurus's voice crackled through the emergency communications system. 2nd hostile evading to the north. 3rd hostile still inbound on the convoy, bearing 085. Mara watched the display with growing alarm as the remaining hostile aircraft closed on the convoy's position. The NATO vehicles had increased speed and altered course again, but they were ground-bound and vulnerable. Against an aircraft armed with air-to-ground missiles, they had virtually no chance of survival. Convoy Alpha, this is Lightning Control, a new voice cut into the communications net. We have visual on hostile aircraft approaching from the southeast. Request immediate air support. The voice belonged to Major Ingrid Voss, the NATO operations coordinator whose name had appeared on the convoy's personnel roster. Mara had read her file during the initial threat assessment, a decorated officer with extensive field experience and a reputation for making hard decisions under pressure. Major Voss, this is Lieutenant Mara Keene, Air Force Communications. I am coordinating this engagement based on real-time threat analysis and surveillance data. The hostile aircraft you're seeing is armed and preparing to engage your position. Lieutenant Keene, there was a pause as Voss processed the name. You're the officer who detected this threat initially? Yes, ma'am, and I am sending you live drone footage.
Cole's fingers flew across the emergency coordination system, routing the drone's camera feed through the convoy's tactical communications network. On Mara's monitor, she could see the feed appear on the convoy's displays. crystal-clear imagery of the hostile aircraft banking toward their position, weapons pods clearly visible under its wings. "Jesus Christ!" Voss muttered, her voice tight with shock. "That's definitely not one of ours. Lightning Control, you are authorized to engage. I repeat, you are authorized to engage the hostile aircraft." "Falcon Lead, you heard the convoy commander," Mara called to Torres. "You are cleared hot on the remaining hostile." "Copy Lightning Control. Falcon Lead engaging." Torres's voice carried the calm professionalism of a pilot who had trained for exactly this moment. "Target acquired, Fox 3. The second missile launch appeared on Mara's tactical display as a bright streak of light racing across the desert sky. The hostile aircraft tried to evade, banking hard to the left and deploying a cloud of chaff and flares, but the AIM-120 was designed to defeat such countermeasures. The missile adjusted its course with mechanical precision, closing the final kilometers in seconds. "Splash 2, Torres announced. "All hostile aircraft neutralized. Convoy Alpha, you are clear of immediate threat." The relief in Major Voss's voice was unmistakable. "Outstanding work, Lightning Control. That was damn fine coordination under pressure." But even as the immediate threat ended, Mara could see the political storm beginning to gather. Her unauthorized use of military assets, her circumvention of the chain of command, and her direct coordination of combat operations would have consequences that reached far beyond Falcon Outpost. "Lightning Control, this is Operations Command." Colonel Harlan's voice cut through the communications net like a blade. "You will immediately cease all unauthorized activities and report for disciplinary action." Mara looked at Cole, who was already documenting everything on the emergency system's data recorders. Whatever happened next, they had proof of what they'd done and why they'd done it. "Operations Command, this is Lightning Control," she replied, her voice calm and professional. "Mission complete. 3 hostile aircraft neutralized. NATO convoy preserved. All actions taken in accordance with emergency protocols to prevent imminent loss of life." The investigation began within hours of the engagement, led by a joint Air Force and NATO intelligence team that descended on Falcon Outpost like a plague of locusts. Colonel Harlan attempted to control the narrative from the beginning, portraying Mara as a rogue operator who had exceeded her authority and endangered military personnel through unauthorized actions. Lieutenant Keene acted without proper authorization, using systems she had no clearance to access. Her history of equipment failures and psychological instability made her unfit for the responsibilities she assumed during this incident. But Harlan had made a critical mistake. In his haste to discredit Mara, he had overlooked the fact that every action taken during the engagement had been automatically recorded by the emergency coordination system. Cole and Torres had spent the past 48 hours compiling a comprehensive digital record that told a very different story. These are the original frequency tables from the Crimson Sky exercise. Cross-reference them with the frequency tables that were actually distributed to Lieutenant Keene's workstation. The discrepancies are significant and systematic. The lead investigator, a stern Air Force colonel named Patricia Wells, studied the documents with growing interest. "Are you suggesting that Lieutenant Keene was provided with incorrect technical data during the exercise?" "I'm stating it as fact," Torres replied. "Someone modified her frequency tables before the exercise, introducing errors that would guarantee communications failures. Lieutenant Keene's actions during Crimson Sky weren't the result of incompetence, they were the result of sabotage." Cole presented his own evidence, detailed logs from the emergency coordination system showing the progression of the threat detection, the attempts to report through official channels, and the systematic dismissal of valid intelligence by Operations Command. Lieutenant Keene detected hostile reconnaissance activity 18 hours before the attack. She filed 2 separate reports through proper channels, both of which were dismissed without investigation. When official channels failed, she used emergency protocols to coordinate a defensive response that saved lives. Major Voss provided the most damning testimony of all.
Her field report, filed immediately after the engagement, credited Mara with preventing what would have been a catastrophic loss of NATO personnel and equipment. Lieutenant Keene's coordination was precise, professional, and decisive. Her threat analysis was accurate, her communications were clear, and her authorization of defensive action was entirely appropriate given the circumstances. Without her intervention, my convoy would have been destroyed. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that painted Colonel Harlan in an increasingly unfavorable light. His modifications to the Crimson Sky frequency tables, his systematic dismissal of valid intelligence reports, his attempts to frame a competent officer as psychologically unstable to cover his own failures. Within a week, Harlan was relieved of command pending a formal court-martial. The charges included falsification of official records, endangering military personnel, and conduct prejudicial.
The evidence suggests a deliberate pattern of misconduct designed to advance Colonel Harlan's career at the expense of subordinate officers, Colonel Wells announced during her final briefing. Lieutenant Keene's actions during both the Crimson Sky exercise and the recent engagement demonstrate exemplary dedication to duty and sound professional judgment. The commendation ceremony took place at Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado, in a conference room filled with senior officers, NATO representatives, and military personnel from across the Joint Command structure. Mara stood at attention in her dress blues, the silver bars of a first lieutenant newly pinned to her collar, as the Secretary of the Air Force read the citation for the Defense Meritorious Service Medal. For exceptionally meritorious service in the detection and neutralization of hostile forces threatening NATO operations, Lieutenant Keene's technical expertise, professional initiative, and decisive action under pressure prevented the loss of military personnel and equipment. Her performance reflects great credit upon herself, the United States Air Force, and the Department of Defense. The medal felt heavier than she had expected as it was pinned to her uniform, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it represented: vindication for months of being dismissed, ignored, and undermined by officers who valued political convenience over operational competence. After the ceremony, Mara was approached by a Navy captain she didn't recognize, who introduced himself as the program director for a joint NATO tactical communications initiative. "We're looking for officers with your particular skill set, the ability to detect patterns others miss, to work effectively under pressure, and to coordinate complex operations across multiple services and allied nations. Would you be interested in discussing a leadership role in the program?" 3 months later, Mara stood before a classroom of newly commissioned communications officers at the Air Force Academy, her quiet voice carrying clearly through the lecture hall as she addressed the next generation of military communicators. Courage doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's found in the willingness to trust your training, to stand by your analysis, and to speak truth to power, even when that truth is unwelcome. Your job is not to tell commanders what they want to hear. It's to provide them with the information they need to make life-and-death decisions. In the back of the classroom, Captain Torres watched with a smile of pride. She had received her own commendation for the engagement, along with a promotion to major and assignment to an elite F-22 squadron. Their friendship, forged in crisis and tested by institutional pressure, had emerged stronger than ever. That evening, Mara found a secure message waiting in her quarters. It was from Major Voss, who had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to NATO's strategic planning staff. "If you ever need a field commander who listens to competent analysis regardless of who provides it, you know where to find me. The operational community needs more officers like you." But the message that intrigued her most came through the same secure communication system she had used to coordinate the F-22 strike. It was brief, encrypted at the highest classification levels, and bore the digital signature of the National Reconnaissance Office. "Lieutenant Keene, your unique analytical capabilities have come to our attention. There is a classified satellite warfare program that could benefit from your expertise. If you're interested in the next challenge, respond through secure channels. The quiet voices are often the ones we need to hear most clearly." Mara stared at the message for a long time, thinking about the journey that had brought her from the humiliation of crimson sky to this moment of opportunity. The desert winds still carried sand through the gaps in military installations across the southwest. Hostile signals still moved through frequencies that most people would never know existed. And somewhere in the vast electronic spectrum of modern warfare, threats were developing that only the most careful observers would detect. She opened her secure communications terminal and began typing her response. The quiet voice that had once been dismissed as weakness was about to become the foundation of something much larger. A new understanding that in the complex world of modern military operations, the ability to listen carefully might be the most powerful weapon of all.
Next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.